Alright guys, today I'm going to talk about the biomes of the world. This is an abbreviated version of the video or of this lecture. We'll do more detail when we get into actually the ecology section, but this will give you what you need to know to get started on your biome project. So biomes are basically ecological areas on the earth that are defined by their geography and their geology and their animals and their plant life. Okay, so if you look at biomes, we have this picture of the earth, and you can see it's color coordinated or color coded. And you can see if you look at the top, all this purple, this is what we call Arctic or alpine tundra. We have this green, which are these temporal boreal forests. And so what that means, if you were to go any of these areas that are purple along this northern portion of the Earth, they would look really similar. It would have, low grass type plants. It would have animals that you might associate with that, like wolves and grizzly bears, maybe polar bears, caribou, and reindeer. So when you look at a biome, the things that you look for are characteristic or key animals and key plants. And also weather patterns. If it's a desert, obviously all these deserts are going to be pretty dry. If it's a tropical area, you're thinking about the tropics, a lot of times like a tropical rainforest, that means it's really wet. So we're going to talk briefly about some of these biomes and what they are, where you can find them, and that'll help set you up for your biome project. All right, so again, this is a nice map. If you're looking to try to figure out where your biome is, because you'll be assigned a biome for your project, you can basically look at this map and try to figure out where on the earth you could go visit to find this biome. Okay, so kind of the simplest definition is the biome is the largest geographic biotic unit. All right, so remember the living portion. A major community of plants and animals that have kind of a similar life forms, that live in similar places, similar environments, and similar conditions. So if you go to a tropical rainforest anywhere on the earth, you're going to see, these large trees and vines. Think of like jungle. So they're going to be very similar, maybe not the same plants, maybe not the same animals, but very, very similar. You may see, things like monkeys and things like that if you're in a rainforest somewhere on the earth. Okay, so again, this is just an introduction to the biomes. Now, they're distributed throughout the earth, and it's based on climate or weather patterns, really is what we're talking about. And so when you look at climate, if it's a dry, arid climate, you're going to see similar animals and plants in dry, arid climates. If you have a desert in the U.S. versus a desert, somewhere else, you may see things like a cactus. You may see things like small rodents that are able to live on very little water. It can just survive on just the dew that they find on the cacti in the morning. So very similar plants and animals can be found in areas that are basically have very similar weather or climate patterns. Now, one of the things that affects climate has to do with where it is on the earth, and specifically latitude. So if you look back and think about a map, I'm going to show you a picture of the earth and talk about latitude and longitude lines. As you change latitude from the equator, north and south from the equator, you'll find that you have similar biomes. Because think about if you were here in maybe Alabama, and then you went to the equator, and then went just as far south from the equator as you went north to Alabama. So that would put you somewhere in Argentina. You would see it looks pretty similar. Okay, there's some very similar characteristics of parts of Argentina as in parts of Alabama. And I'm going to show you a map of that in just a minute. But as you go toward the equator, the center of the earth, that's going to be the hotter climates. And as you go further away from the equator, north and south, it gets colder. You guys probably know that. Okay. Now, the other thing about looking at biomes, looking at temperature and climate and weather, is elevation also makes a difference. So every time you go up 100 feet in elevation, that's like going 600 miles north. So if you've ever been to the Rockies, you can go to the top of those mountains that are like 14,000 feet, and it really looks like you're in the Arctic. Okay, they're snow covered, they have glaciers. If you're around 12,000 feet, it looks like tundra. We call that alpine, but it looks like tundra like you would see in Alaska. So a lot of times you can see the same biomes just by going up. That's one of the cool things about going to the big island of Hawaii. If you go to Mauna Kea, which is the big volcano, you start at the bottom, you're in jungle, and by the time you get to the top, you're on a snow-capped mountain. It's pretty cool. So just to make sure everybody knows their geography, which a lot of times people are a little weak in geography, so just to kind of understand what that means, if you look at a globe or a map, we divide the Earth with these lines. So the lines that go east-west, okay, the ones that go this way. Let's see if I can get my pen working today. Let's see. Here we go. Let me go back. If you look at the lines that go this way, these are latitude lines, and the lines that go this way are longitude lines. Okay, so if you do GPS and it tells you where you are, you give latitude and longitude coordinates. All right, and so we're primarily going to talk about latitude lines today. So the main latitude line, kind of the starting point, the 0 latitude, is the equator. It's the one that goes right through the center of the Earth. As you go north, the numbers will go from 0 all the way up, and as you go north and south. So this is 23 degrees south, this is 23 degrees north, 66 degrees south, 66 degrees north. So the numbers go up as you go toward the poles, basically. So around 23 south and 23 north, these are our tropic lines. So this line is called the Tropic of Capricorn, and this is the Tropic of Cancer. So you may have heard someone say, oh, let's go to the tropics, and you thought, that just means somewhere warm. Well, it does, but it also has a real meaning because it's this area that's between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. So if you go around Mexico, you go to Cozumel, you'll actually be in the tropics because you're south of the Tropic of Cancer. If you go somewhere around Colombia and Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru, you're going to be in the Tropic of Capricorn. So what I was saying earlier about here we are in Alabama, so if you go equidistant, so from the equator to Alabama, you go that same distance down this way, the climate here can be really, really similar. It's kind of like being in Alabama. If you've been to that part of Argentina, it might look familiar to you. One of the things as you're looking at these biomes you'll find, let's go back. Let's draw the equator around through here. And you'll see that as the biomes go north and south as you go equidistant from that equator. So we don't really have a purple down here, but if in Antarctica, we can't really see it. That would be our Arctic, and then the North Pole would be here. But notice around the equator, you have these tropical rainforests. Around the equator in Africa, tropical rainforest. Around the equator in the South Pacific, tropical rainforest. Again, like I said, Alabama has these what we call temperate deciduous forests, these oak hickory forests. They have something very similar in this portion of South America over in Chile. And what we call the Great Plains, our big prairies, that's really more similar to Argentina than Alabama, actually. So if you go out into Kansas and Nebraska and you go into Argentina, it's going to look very similar. All right? So notice that your biomes kind of mirror each other as you go north and south. All right. Now, part of the reason that your biomes go mirror each other as you go north and south is because we have seasons. We know when it's summer here, it's winter in Australia, right, south of the equator. When it's winter here, it's summer south of the equator. And that all has to do with the rotation of the Earth around the sun and also the tilt. Okay, so if you didn't know that before, the Earth does not rotate on an up and down axis. We're kind of slightly tilted, and as the Earth is moving around the sun because of that tilt, that causes, during the summer, the northern hemisphere tilts toward the sun. That's why it's warmer that time of year. And in the wintertime, the northern hemisphere points away from the sun, and so we don't get as much heat, so it's colder. All right, so again, that's some basic physical science that you probably guys had in high school, just reminding you. The other reason that the biomes kind of mirror each other as you go north and south of the equator is because of what are called Hadley circles. They're global wind patterns. You probably have heard of the Gulf Stream or, you know, the tropical Gulf Stream, or when you have these Arctic blasts that come in, and airflow comes down from the Arctic and changes our weather, and we get snow and things like that. Well, they're pretty predictable, and they make what we call Hadley circles, and we'll talk about this again later. But basically, if you start at the equator, um, warm, kind of wet air basically will rise and then fall back out as rain. And it's just kind of a continuing circle. And it does it in opposite directions if you're going, so it goes this way going north and it goes that way going south. So because it's this kind of regularly repeating cycle, you wind up with these kind of mirror image biomes. So you have what we call these polar zones at either end, and these subtropical zones at either end, and then you have tropical zones on either side of the equator. And it really has to do with these Hadley cells. And again, we'll do more details later, but I just wanted to throw that out in case when you did your biomes you came across that term and didn't know what it meant. It's just basically these global wind circulation patterns that allow for basically rainfall, really. So again, here's another picture of these biomes. There's some question about exactly how many there are. We're going to break it down to basically 8 for our project this time. We're going to go with kind of 8 basic biomes, but you can even break it down into smaller and smaller biomes. But the main ones we're going to talk about are tundra, which again you're going to see in these far northern climates. Also high elevation, so you'll see some tundra in the Rockies and down in the Andes. Taiga, which is basically coniferous forests. This is what you see all across Alaska and through Russia. You see temperate coniferous forests. This is what you see out like the redwoods, things like that. When you go out to Vancouver and San Francisco, you'll see those kind of forests. Deciduous forest, that's what we have here. That's basically what you see in the Smoky Mountains and the Bankhead Forest is what we see here. You have chaparral here, and kind of out, if we think about out west, we have some chaparral. Deserts, a lot of deserts through the Middle East. Grasslands and savanna, very common to see, out toward Africa. Tropical rainforest all around the equator. And the highlands, or where it's pretty cold, like in Greenland. All right, so that's just an idea of where they are. So when you get your biome, again, you can look at this map or you can Google it and figure out where in the world you could find an example of your biome, okay? And we'll talk about that in class on how you're going to do your project. So there's a lot of disagreement on exactly how many biomes there are, but we're going to go with 8 land biomes. You have tropical rainforests, tropical savannas, deserts, chaparral, grassland, temperate, deciduous, and boreal, or that means coniferous, basically, forests. But you also have water biomes, and I'm going to include that as part of your project so that some of you guys get to do some things about oceans and lakes and streams and ponds and things. So we have freshwater biomes like streams and lakes, and even glaciers, those are freshwater, and saltwater biomes like coral reefs and pelagic, which means basically open water or deep water. And then estuaries are those things that are between fresh and salt water, like swamps and bayous, like things like down around Louisiana or the Everglades, where salt and fresh water are in contact with each other, and you have like tides will basically move the salt water and fresh water in and out every day as the tides come in and go out. All right, and tundra, sorry. All right, so tropical rainforest, just quickly, found around the equator. They are called rainforests because they get a ton of rain, okay? They don't have very much change in their temperature because they're around the equator, and so it gets an equal amount of sunlight all the time, so very little variation in temperature. And about 50% of all the world's animal species are found here, so very, very biodiverse. So if you have the biome of tropical rainforest, you need to find out in your particular rainforest, whether it be here or in Borneo or Africa or South America, wherever your rainforest is, what is a key species? What can I expect to see? What animal? What plant? what are some things that I want to see in those rainforests? Savannas, these are basically grasslands that have a couple of trees in them. Think about savannas when you think about if you want to go see an African safari and go see the giraffes and the zebras, things like that. They usually have a wet and a dry season, and typically they're pretty hot. Okay, don't get just a ton of rain, but again, it's wet and dry, so you're going to have periods where it's kind of almost drought-like, and then where it's almost what they call the monsoon season, lots of rain. Lots of grazing animals, more than you'll see anywhere else. So think of the wildebeests. When you think about the wildebeest migrations in Africa, that's where you would see a tropical savanna. Deserts typically are going to be between 25 and 45 latitude, although there are some outside of that. Very little rain. That's 25 centimeters for a whole year. And temperatures can range pretty wild. I mean, they can be high and low. The thing about deserts is they may stay the same throughout the year. They will have seasonal changes, but some of the biggest changes can come daytime and nighttime. You can go to a desert in the daytime, it would be around 100 degrees, something that you guys recognize, Fahrenheit. I know Celsius means nothing to you. And at night, deserts can drop down into the 30s easily. Because they don't have a lot of vegetation, there's not a lot of things to hold in the heat. So deserts tend to be hot during the day and cold at night. Chaparral, this is what you kind of see sometimes. You think about like old westerns where the tumbleweeds are. So you find those in latitudes between 32 and 40, typically on the west coast. Receives moderate amounts of rain, mostly in the winter. We'll get a lot of snow. The plants you find there are usually low, shrubby type plants that are really resistant to drought. Okay, you'll see this in California. So a lot of those wildfires in California are in areas where they have chaparral. Grasslands, it's kind of like a savanna. You don't typically see a lot of trees like you do in a savanna. And they usually have to have some kind of a water source like water or stream. They receive a moderate amount of rainfall. And temperatures can vary greatly. Think about the grasslands of like Kansas and Nebraska. So it can be hot or it can be cold depending on the season. It doesn't really vary as much during the day like the deserts do, but it varies seasonally. Temperate deciduous forest. This is moderate climate like Alabama where we live. This is deciduous, means the tree's going to lose their leaves in the wintertime. Temperatures can vary anywhere from minus 30 to positive 30 Celsius, just like Alabama. So you know the weather here, so same weather. And rain can vary. It's seasonal as well. We know we have spring rains where we tend to have a lot of rain and not a lot of rain in the summer. So annual rainfall varies seasonally. If you have a really good deciduous forest that hasn't been clear cut and it's stable and kind of a mature forest, you'll have these nice tall trees and then an understory. In Alabama, you would expect to see things like dogwoods, things like that in the understory. Temperate boreal forest, this is also known as taiga or coniferous forests. These are what you find along just subarctic, so kind of the top, right before you get into tundra. So you go taiga, then tundra, then Arctic, which is basically snow-covered. And so it's going to be these upper far north and far south latitudes, cold, get summer rain, very few reptiles, not a lot of understory. These are huge trees. Think about like redwood forest, kind of get that as kind of an idea in your head. And they're so big, they shade out everything, that there's not a lot of stuff that can grow underneath in these temperate boreal forests. You can expect to see things like bear and moose and things like that here. All right, tundra, no trees. Okay, tundra means treeless, and a lot of times it's marshy, so there's going to be a lot of water present. Typically it has permafrost, which means the ground, it's actually frozen and it stays frozen. It doesn't thaw out. When we talk about bacteria, we do talk about anthrax and how we're seeing areas where the permafrost due to global warming is thawing and the anthrax is starting to show up again. So because it stays frozen, things can't really They don't really grow very well. You just have some small, really small plants there. And let's see, not a lot of precipitation there, but you do get very wet, marshy ground because it's so cold. The water that is there doesn't evaporate. Freshwater, that means it's not salt. Okay, so that's lakes and ponds and streams and glaciers and even the ice caps. Of course, temperature, who knows? It depends on where you're talking about. Are you talking about glaciers or are you talking about a lake in Florida? So it really depends on where you are. The temperature can vary greatly, as can the rain. Fresh water comes from the rain, so there has to be some rain at some point so it can run off and shed. We've talked about watersheds, shed and collect in these rivers, streams, and ponds. Salt water means salt. That's the oceans and seas and coral reefs. All right. Again, temperature and precipitation vary because it depends on where you are. Are you in the South Seas? Are you in the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian Ocean, etc.? All right. But again, where does it come from? Well, it does rain over the ocean, and then the rivers run into the oceans. So your eventual source of water is rain and runoff. All the water eventually runs to the oceans after it falls on the earth eventually. Either rains directly into the ocean or it runs off from the streams and rivers. An estuary, that's where you have a mixture of fresh and salt water. So somewhere like Chesapeake Bay or Mobile Bay, where you're going to see the mixture of fresh and salt water. Again, temperature and precipitation vary. There's a big difference between being on the Chesapeake Bay and Mobile Bay. Okay. Now, the cool thing about estuaries is the saltiness, the salinity is going to change based on the tides. So when the ocean's coming in, the estuaries will be more salty, and when the tide's going out, they'll be less salty. So these are some pretty cool animals that live there. They have to be able to acclimate and live in changing saltiness, and that's a pretty good trick. So if you do estuaries, you might want to pick an animal and try to figure out how it does that. So when you're doing your biome, remember, you got to think about everything that's in that biome, because the biome is not only the living stuff, the biotic, it's also the abiotic. All right, and so think about those levels of organization. We're not really going to start with the molecules or the cells, but think about the organisms. What organisms live there? Which populations are there? Which communities? Remember, communities, so if a buffalo is the organism and a bison herd is the population, the community is going to be the bison and the prairie dogs and the eagles and everything there, including the grass that they eat. Okay? Remember, the ecosystem includes the non-living stuff. That's the streams, the rocks, the air, and the living stuff. You got to put it all together. And the goal of this whole project is for us to take a tour around the biosphere. So we're going to look at all the different biomes and try to explore different parts of the earth and see where we can explore and take a vacation all throughout our biosphere. All right, so that just gets you started, at least for now. We'll do more details on biomes later, but that's a good jumping off place. Thanks a lot.